Yeah, let's jump into to this topic. Just to really quickly introduce myself. So in the past, this is a topic that I've found myself in the middle of as an open source maintainer, wanting to collect data on how my project was being used. And the reason for that was I was wondering, should I quit my job to work on my open source stuff full time? I had companies using some of my projects, and I was trying to make this decision, but not really having much of the data about it. Today, I still work specifically on this topic as the founder and CEO of Scarf. Pushing forward for usage analytics so we as maintainers can understand how our work is actually being used out in the world. And so most of the lessons that we'll talk about today, I've learned the hard way, one way or another. So we'll talk about these things kind of from first person experience. And then if this is a topic that's interesting to you broadly, I also co-host the Hacking Open Source Business podcast. We've had guests like Robert Hodges from Altinity, one of the organizers of this conference. So do check out that episode. Yeah, so please do jump in with questions if you have them. We'll answer them at the end. Keep in mind, nothing in this talk is legal advice, so please talk to your legal team about any data collection policies. If this talk inspires you to do more of it. I just in general ask, analytics and open source has been a divisive topic historically, increasingly less so over time, but just keep an open mind. We're talking about if you find yourself needing to collect some kind of information about how your open source project is being used, how to go about that. We'll be less talking about the should you or should you not topic. It's more, if you need to, how should you do it? Okay. And I guess I've given this talk before in person where I kind of pull the audience for, who's there, but we'll skip that part here because it's given that it is virtual. Okay. So for collecting usage analytics in open source, why would we actually need to do this in the first place? Let's just kind of preface that. And the question here, if you are the maintainer of open source project, if you are running a business around that, like a lot of the analytical databases, analytical tools here might be, how do these projects, how do you as maintainers answer hard questions about the open source community? Where in the world is everyone? How do people find us? What versions of the software are people using? And especially if you're a business, which company is actually relying on your work and who can we sell to? Like, all of these are really important questions that you may want to know. But what we'll see is that these are hard things to answer by default. And these are really important things to understand, because if we're trying to build sustainable companies around these open source projects, the open source community is the most important part of the whole thing. The people relying on the work, the people contributing, people joining in. That's why we're building an open source. That's what makes it so great. And so understanding that community is crucial. But that group, that open source community at large is a lot more than you might traditionally be able to measure. And so typically we'll interact directly with collaborators on the project. If people are coming in, GitHub issues or forums, chat, etc. And then of course these kinds of events is how you might engage with your community. But you miss a lot of people that way, right? Like, that's really, in a lot of ways, just the tip of the iceberg. Most of the people that use your open source are never going to come tell you about it. They're never going to engage with you. But people who might be just quietly using it, engaging with your content, just hacking away with the software putting out there. Those really are part of your community, and potential people that could be contributors, could be customers, etc. But they may not actually come tell you that they are there. So you're going to miss a lot of people. The ones that are actually coming to engage with you, typically what we've seen is a very small subset of your actual user base. One thing that I find really interesting in open source, it's some of the most technologically sophisticated folks in the world. And when we look at how we do data collection in practice, surveys tend to be the state of the art. But as many of you who have ever actually put out a survey to an open source user base know, most of your users will not fill it out. And the people that do, it's really hard to write a good survey that does not bias the users, that actually gets a really, really good, um, statistically significant but unbiased poll. There's also like people have stated preferences versus what their revealed preferences actually are. People don't always behave the way that they tell you that they will behave. And so surveys, which is what the open source ecosystem tends to rely on, is really not a great way to do this in practice. Um, and so, I think it's a reasonable question if you are not, if you're not super familiar with this ecosystem, is like, why is it so hard to just track everything that you might want to measure, especially in this analytical world, right, where we want to have a very data-driven approach to whatever kind of work we are doing. What's so hard about just tracking all of these things, right? Um, and the unsurprising answer to many of you is that open source users just don't want to be tracked. The general guidance for how to do this is, oh, you should just not do this, right? Um, if you do any Google searches around on this topic, um, you will see a myriad of projects that tried to introduce some kind of metric tracking, version heartbeats, these kinds of things, and people pushing back on it really significantly. Notably, GitLab at one point tried to roll out analytics and was met with a lot of user pushback, and actually reverted some of those changes. And you see this from big companies like GitLab all the way down to hobbyists and individual developers. And I think that's a well, it makes it a lot harder for these projects to actually understand anything about the impact of the work that they are doing and putting out there for free, right? Um, but like sometimes it's okay, which is kind of interesting. And so you see examples of very big companies and big projects, Vercel, Next.js, NPM, will all collect tons of data about how their projects are being used, and users have been just totally fine with it. And so, like, it's an interesting question. Like, what's the difference between GitLab and NPM? They're collecting very similar data, they do it in very similar ways, but the end user community, the response, very different. And so I think that's one of the things that we're going to dive into here. And so one big topic when it comes to, both people's opinions on this and how to actually collect data responsibly is obviously safety and security. And so a primary topic here is a concept to be aware of here is personally identifiable information. Um, depending on where in the world you are, what jurisdiction you are dealing with, there's different definitions for this. But here in the United States, we're looking at any representation of information that could be used um, directly or indirectly to infer someone's identity. And so that's a very broad question. But if you are going to go out and collect usage information on, installs or downloads or telemetry, one question that you'll have to answer, and it's a very fundamental one, is what are you going to do with personally identifiable information, and how are you going to handle it? Um, you know, uh, an IP address is personally identifiable information with respect to GDPR. And so, if you can avoid storing it at all, you will sidestep a variety of complications with things like compliance and security, and we'll get to all of these things. But if you can just totally sidestep having to store it at all, you're going to be in a much better position by default. And one thing that I think is interesting, and I didn't know going into this, is that this is not a black or white thing. The surface area of your PII storage actually matters quite a bit. And so storing less PII is better than storing more PII. It's not like an all or nothing kind of thing. If you are going to store it, storing it temporarily is better than storing it permanently. And this is both like a logical argument, like, what is your surface area to get hacked, to leak sensitive information? The less time you have it and the less that you store, obviously, the less risk there is. But that also, that's not just a logical argument, that also, covers your legal basis as well. If you are looking at something like GDPR, there's a lot of kind of gray areas to these regulations. And it's not the case that, just by having it, some of it for some amount of time, you're suddenly in a completely different space than if, this is a spectrum. It is not just an all or nothing kind of thing. Of course, you also want to make sure that you are encrypting that data both at rest and in transit. And so, for instance, if you are tracking things like IP addresses, rather than storing a raw IP address, you could actually hash it. If you're going to hash it, you should also salt it. Um, and that's a way to get some kind of notion of a stable identifier while also not storing sensitive information that could expose someone's identity if the data were to be leaked. We've mentioned GDPR here already, and so on the compliance side, really that tends to be the first thing that people will bring up when talking about compliance in the open source space. If you want to collect data, um, abiding by GDPR is not. It's definitely a non-trivial set of regulations to abide by, but it tends to be cast as this just very, challenging thing to get past. Oh, and I'm getting low on time, so I got to really speed up here. But overall, I think um, businesses often have what's called a legitimate basis to collect this data. And so, things like asking for consent, notices, opt in, opt out, legitimate basis actually is one of these things that makes it so that things like opt in consent, being able to do opt in by default analytics are more achievable if you have a legitimate basis to process that data. Businesses tend to have legitimate basis to understand how their software is being used. And so you should be thoughtful about first versus third party analytics. All of these trade offs when it comes to if you're going to have downstream data processors process your analytics versus do it yourself. All of these things will affect your compliance footprint. Of course, consent. You have to think about opt-in versus opt-out. Are you going to collect the data by default versus not? Are you going to give people different ways of opting in versus opting out? And so one thing that's really tricky to keep in mind with the in the open source space is that not every environment can easily opt out in the same way that you might provide. So, if you provide an environment variable opt out, for instance, like when your CLI is installed, well, that's great for people, but it might not be feasible to opt out that way in a CI environment, right? Not every environment is being operated by a human, and so it's really important here that we offer different mechanisms of opting out. So, if you're doing it based on the web, any kind of web analytics, are you abiding by, things like global privacy control headers, do not track headers? Are you giving standard CLI flags for opting out? Of course, sometimes it is compelling to simply say, okay, well, I'm going to do opt-in analytics where people are opted out by default and they can enable it. So that sidesteps a lot of these consent issues. But unfortunately, in practice, what we've seen is that the vast majority of people will never opt in, and you basically have worthless analytics that don't really catch most of your user base. And so, this is I think this is one spot to be very thoughtful about to make sure that you are collecting enough data to be statistically significant and representative, but also making sure that people have ample ways to give consent. All right. Let's see. So ethics and usage data. I think another one that especially if you get into kind of the more philosophical aspects of open source and what it means to be able to own data about usage information with an open source project. And so one of the things that comes up often in this discussion is people saying, well, is it even ethical to collect usage information on an open source project, right? Because open source is supposed to be, permissionless, frictionless to use, and perhaps they claim, the even very nature of collecting data might violate some of those principles. And I think whether we like it or not, I think my argument would be that this is really no longer a practical question to, or it's fine to ask these philosophical questions, but it's no longer very practical because most of this data is already being collected by someone. And what I mean by that is that any open source project that you download online, if you pull down a database in a Docker image from Docker Hub, you download an npm package, a JavaScript package from npm, or you git clone a GitHub repository from GitHub. Your machine has to go on the internet and fetch some resource on the internet and expose information about your machine, right? And so this is an unavoidable fact of the internet. And this data is being collected. And so whether or not this data should be collected, that ship has sailed. We now need to there's other questions that we need to be asking and answering about this data. So it's not should we collect it, but it's other things like who should have access to it, how should this data be stored, how should it be used, how should consent be managed, and so when we look at things like package registries and container registries, who do we want to have access to data about the usage of those packages, right? And so where we are today is that the platform gets to have access to that. But my argument is if anyone should have access, the maintainers of that software are one of those people that should absolutely have access to that data. It's their work, it's their publish, it's their copyright. And this is where I'm injecting my opinion here. I believe that this data should at least be in the hands of the maintainers, if not the open source community as well. But these are the kinds of questions that I think we really need to be having a more open discussion about, because these are the questions that we're actually being faced with, rather than kind of these higher level, like, well, should we or should we not collect it? That it's been collected, it's being collected, and the kind of genie's out of the bottle already. Um, and so when it comes to this topic, the fact that the data is already being collected, what we see is that people's expectations really matter quite a bit. And so when you look at NPM, um, they are a first party platform. You are using NPM's, CLI, their registry. Um, and so it fits into people's expectations that NPM might be collecting some information. And so, the overall principle here I've been starting to solidify in my work with all of a variety of open source projects and businesses that do this is this concept of expectation fit. Does the mechanism by which you are collecting data fit into people's expectations about how and when you are going to collect it? So NPM had very high expectation fit. Then if you look at a different example like Fedora, who recently tried to roll out analytics, into Fedora itself, was met with a lot of pushback because they had set the expectation for decades that they weren't going to do that. And so by switching things up, people are caught off guard, and people tend to push back on those changes. We had a very similar thing with one of our libraries called Scarf.js, which was basically an NPM package. You would add it as a dependency and it would fire off a post installation hook. Maintainers really loved it, but when we first rolled it out, it ran into a lot of end user pushback because post installation hooks from an unknown third party, very low. That was not what people were expecting, and so it was met with more pushback. And that's something that has since changed a bit in terms of what we do over time. But this concept, I think, is a very, very strong indicator for how your analytics are going to be received by your open source community. Should you introduce them to a project with, especially with a broad user base. And so, as maintainers, it's really important to set your community's expectations, to set them well and set them early. So, suddenly adding a bunch of analytics to a project that previously didn't have them, you might run into a lot of problems. If you are launching a project with these kinds of things in mind, you're going to have a much easier time. And so, there's nothing wrong with aiming to, commercialize your open source project, to collect lots of analytics. But really the thing that matters the most is being really clear with your community about what your project goals are, how your actions align with those goals, with those values, what's in it for you, what's in it for them. And if you're doing all of these things and managing expectations really well, we see a lot of success with rolling out analytics, actually understanding your user base in a much, in a much more robust fashion, because you were being transparent and aligned with your communities. But of course, this is something that this is dynamic. People's expectations move, new people show up, people leave, things in the world change, and so this is easier said than done. And I think anyone that's run teams, has dealt with this kind of thing. Even managing expectations internally is easier said than done. So when it comes to collecting this data, it's definitely important to think about how you're actually going to collect usage information. So if you want to track things like installs, how many users do we have? Where are our users? Where are they located? A couple different routes you can go. And what we've seen a lot of success with is just using server access logs from whatever registry you're serving your artifacts from. Your users have to fetch the software from somewhere, and so somewhere there are access logs that can be used. And so things like package downloads, things pixel downloads, things like embedding tracking, cookieless tracking pixels into docs, that has very high expectation fit, and we see that go over very well with users. Telemetry is one that can be a little bit more tricky. Things like version checks and heartbeats, tracing, event logging, that one we see a much broader, much more variance with what the expectation fit looks like. Sometimes telemetry can be very subversive and sinister. Other times it's, very expected and normal, and it really depends on your execution. And I think, what we saw earlier with, the examples of like GitLab and Red Hat, it's good to be transparent, but that alone is not enough, right? I think being clear about what you collect, why you collect it, when you collect it, like all of these things can directly impact that expectation fit metric. Really, if you're being really transparent, but your values are not aligning with your community, you're going to run into a hard time. If you're saying, I'm going to collect all this data and then I'm going to spam you with like sales and marketing ads, people are not going to like that. And so, it's important to both be transparent about what your expectations are, ensuring your community has similar expectations, and managing that alignment. Of course, you'll need to think through who has access to the data, right? Are you going to publish it publicly, whatever metrics you collect? Are you going to share those insights that you've learned with your community? It's a great way to broker trust. And so, we certainly encourage, if you are going to collect usage data, on any amount of your open source project, to think through carefully about what you're going to share back with your community and what you're going to keep private. And you're going to have to balance these things about user privacy, versus keeping everyone in your community in the loop. Okay, so I'm getting right to time here, but really just to wrap up, the main points that I'm trying to imbue here is that, if you are managing an open source project, especially if you're building a business around that open source project, usage analytics can absolutely be done, in a safe and ethical way. But you have to pay attention to a lot of different considerations, and manage your community's expectations. Analytics with, there's it looks like some text got cut off here. Apologies. If your usage analytics have a high expectation fit your community is expecting, things will probably be very smooth sailing for you. And if you kind of maintain those expectations, you're going to be in a good spot. And that's just generally good advice, even outside of analytics. This is just, your roadmap, the way you make decisions, your project governance, all of these things you want to make sure will align with the way that your community, with the way that they're thinking about your project as well. Analytics is where that is very, very crucial as well. And so I hope that this talk, inspires more open source projects to have a more data driven approach to the way that they run their work and their communities, but do it in a way that is responsible and in line with what open source users want and expect.